And I'm wondering, from where you're sitting also, I mean, you guys are obviously ramping up.
But I have not talked about automation.
The image creation side is an add-on, of course, to the sort of classic like plan, all this other stuff. But I'm wondering how you're balancing this sort of stuff.
Thank you for being here. My name is Pascal van Dort. I'm working for Rockfon as a Global Acoustics Ambassador. You started, Zaha Hadid, the VR group in 2014.
Yep, you haven't mentioned how long I've been in the practice, which is 97. So I joined the company when we were 19 altogether, and it was all pen and paper. We also started a physical model workshop. The design process was clearly physical. And then successively we moved the entire design process, the entire workflow into computerized environments using software that was mainly coming from entertainment. I mean, you had drafting, but then also the whole visualization. I mean, the whole ideating was done digitally. So by the time 2014, I was an architect and a designer. Until then, I executed, luckily, some projects with the practice, international projects, highly complex, various different parties, obviously. And we had a full three-dimensional digital model and process in place. So with 2014, we had the opportunity to look at the DK1, which is the Oculus, now Meta, headset, which was a technological matter using miniaturized mobile phone technology. And it became affordable. Also, our compute at the time was already pretty okay. I mean, now we would be laughing at it at this 5-6 pixels, stereoscopic, but it was a mind-blowing experience that convinced me that we can visualize, we can communicate space making in a way that suits us and our industry, because everything else is two-dimensional. I mean, drawings, sections, I mean, these are highly abstract tools that I don't want to miss. But clearly talking to end customers, non-experts, non-professionals. The other aspect of it is also, and it's probably every architect knows that, when you finally execute a project and you're inside the project, right, in full scale for the first time, throughout the entire process, which takes years, there is sort of a margin of error. I mean, I've tested it myself, and you look at even 3D models projected on 2D, you realize that you're not necessarily comprehending the scale, the exact scale. So that was really amazing. I mean, it was very efficient, very economical to move three-dimensional assets into game engines, which also became available at the time.
Because you're a gamer also, right?
I was a gamer. I still am. I've obviously had to economize a little bit. But it was one of the big things in my career that I managed to combine architectural space making and the kind of experiential journeys that are sometimes a bit blatant in gaming, but it is a very interactive, very involved, narrative-based experience that, for example, film will never have, right? You're a consumer, you're sitting outside of something that is dictated to you. And I think that's also will lead to, I think, another discussion that we might have or might not have. But VR as a medium is clearly not physical reality. It's clearly not the same as we would, let's say, engage in physical reality. And therefore, there's a bit of a hybrid, but also a lot of knowledge needed and practice to manage the medium. It's not filmmaking, it's not game making either, if we're using the technologies, but we'll see.
Yeah,
it's been a long journey.
This conversation is also about exploring the architectural boundaries, and VR and AI is absolutely one of them. So I think it's good that you started this in 2014. Then a core question for you, and that of course is related to not 3XN but GXN. And can you tell a little bit more about that?
So I work in GXN. We are a separate company that was spun out as a startup company, a sister company from 3XN in 2007. Really with the idea that while there is, on these long projects that Helmut talked about, they go on for a long time, there's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of very skilled people involved, so there's a lot of research that can happen and innovation that can happen on projects. But if something goes wrong at that scale, there's also a lot of money involved and a lot of people involved and a lot of other things, so risks scale quite quickly, and all of a sudden you have a lot of lawyers involved, right? So there's certain things you don't get to do. there's a lot of questions you don't get to ask. You don't get to test out a new material on your facade that you haven't tested out before. You don't get to play around with robotics technology to see if you can manufacture something, right? I mean, there's certain things that you simply cannot do from within the confines of the way architecture projects work. And so the idea with GXN is basically to do all that. So you could say we get to do all the stuff the architects don't get to do. Increasingly, we're also getting to be working with the architects. We've sort of had our teenage phase and are now maturing and being invited back into the nice room again and get to sit alongside the architects on projects. But the way we work is primarily our focus is on how to reduce the environmental footprint of our buildings while also thinking about how we can improve life for people inside the buildings. These are sort of the two key things that we're looking at. So we focus a lot on the circular economy and what we call behavioral design, which is sort of informed design, thinking about the future uses, going out, seeing how buildings work and all this stuff. We work in a mix between externally funded research projects and increasingly commercial consultancy work where we take what we learned in these research projects and scale it up at scale with 3XN and others.
Yeah, I think it's important to also listen to your clients and the users in the end, right?
I mean, it was a very interesting shift to go from. There's been a lot of changes for us in the last 4 or 5 years, which has to do with new requirements coming into the built environment. So there's a whole different appetite for. People would like to hear about circular economy 5 or 6 years ago, but when it came time to pay for circular economy, it was maybe a little bit of a different story. That's changing now, and that means that we are getting into projects and working with the decision makers in a new way. And I think it was quite eye-opening from a person. I'm an academic by background and used to drive our research program. Understanding the challenges from the decision makers' perspective really has changed the way we're asking questions and what we're pursuing in our research as well. So it's been quite interesting to see that balance and figure out how to deal with that at the moment as well.
Yeah. Next question again for you, Helmut. How was Zaha Hadid's virtual reality group improved in the design process and client presentation?
I mean, that's obviously a heavy one. We have done many things over these last 10 years. I would imagine that the immediate response to a virtual, real-time, immersive experience that we provide clearly allows access to an understanding of space that is unbeatable, comparing it to the old, let's say, traditional range of methods of communication. Clearly, the evolution of the technology allowed us to have co-presence, so we can have networked experiences from people all over the world meeting in one simulation, in one space. So that affords us to lose air travel and time. I mean, there are many aspects, I think, that would feed into the benefits of this technology. As I said, I'm agnostic. I think whatever is working, whatever we need in order to communicate, we will use. So VR hasn't taken over the way we communicate space, but it clearly has added and fluidly connected into our design process and our workflow. I mean, we have other research that feeds into it. I mean, agent-based simulations. I mean, spatial optimization, layout studies are things that we can incorporate. So it's really a big bandwidth that we can capture. In a way that really taps into embodied knowledge, not just abstract information that is absorbed from a distance, but you're actually really involved and engaged. It has improved the way we interact within ourselves. We have design evaluations, we have simulations within the design workflow. So this happens in synchronicity to the actual design work within the teams, and then obviously with stakeholders and outside parties where we can really polish and experience something that will cost a lot of money. What is also quite fascinating, we had a project, it was a test project called Big World, where we onboarded all the engineering data, I mean, all the multidisciplinary aspects, the authoring that is taking place in architectural projects can be viewed, can be layered, so you can access and collisions, you can really see how a project will come together. And design options. I mean, I think this is tremendous. I mean, the kind of congregation of different aspects that can be fused in one real, let's say, real world simulation prior to execution.
Kåre, do you see that 3XN is also going forward into this direction in the future?
We've been exploring VR for as long as I've been around in the business. There's been a computational design team that was born in GXN and migrated into 3XN as the work that they were doing was becoming much more integrated into projects. So we have the technology. We've been playing around with it. We've been using it. I think it's the same experience of especially client presentations being something that's interesting. I think we've also learned what you were mentioning there, Helmut, that it's a new medium, and a new medium comes with opportunities and challenges, and the stage managing of the experience within the VR thing becomes quite important. Directing attention to what matters, avoiding this sort of fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where somebody starts getting way too serious about something that's still a developing design model, for example. Like, there's a lot of challenges there. I guess the other thing that I'd be interested also in hearing Helmut's experiences with was VR as a collaborative tool for the designers. I know we've had some experiments with Astaire, for example, evaluating the angles on how that was being built up, which you kind of needed to be able to see it in space somehow, and that was helpful. But I'm wondering what your experience has been bringing these different professions in, for example, and whether you see that as a positive venue for collaboration, or does it allow you to do something you wouldn't be able to do in a meeting room with a screen?
So the short answer is yes.
Good.
Okay, thank you. The next question.
But there is a question which programs we are using. So we are working exclusively with Unreal Engine. I mean, there's ultimately two different products on the market. One is Unity and Unreal, so just to be democratic about it. But we prefer the fidelity and the realism. But we had a research project, Horizon funded research project on a multidisciplinary design platform, immersive real-time platform. And a lot of questions immediately arise with GDPR IP, right? How do you author into a singular information space, but own up to your liabilities and also own your content? Clearly, with AI coming in, you have asynchronous production. I mean, for example, these oralization I mentioned, we have audio simulation of spaces that we can understand how spaces listen and sound like. And, when you have structural engineering, you have service engineering coming in and authoring into that space across the globe, accessible 24/7. I mean, there's an economy behind that, right? And of course, you have communication tools, you have chat, voice over IP. So I think it's really stunning. Having spent a lot of time on planes, traveling across, having meetings, and there's always a disconnect. So I would say yes, if we get it to work, because there's a lot of problems still, right? We're still at the early days. How do you operate this data? How do you make it archivable, retrievable? And again, also the IP issues in professional circumstances. It is not possible to just simply bake things together, right? And there's liabilities and client overview, quality assurance things. But ultimately, you could imagine to have a space where we can sketch, we can talk, we can create and import assets and really fuse space together in this simulation.
How does GXN become involved in the design process with 3XN? In one talk you mentioned that's true that in the early environment it's preferred, but why is that then?
So there's a couple of answers here, but I think overall GXN and 3XN, we are separate companies. We work very closely together. We share an office here in Copenhagen. GXN is involved from the earliest stages of competitions where we help bring specialist knowledge around, for example, behavior, carbon, materials, upcycling, circular economy into the concept development. A lot of decisions are being made quite early on that has a large impact on sustainability, for example, and that's why we would like to be part of these conversations. So there in the conversation phase, it's about conceptualization, understanding the possibilities and challenges in a brief from our sort of very particular way of looking at it, while allowing 3XN the freedom to do what they do best and drive forward fantastic design, right? On projects where we are developing the project, GXN works as a separate consultancy. We take on roles as a specialist or general sustainability consultant. We manage carbon budgets for projects, help drive through carbon-driven design decisions. A lot of the time when we're working in London, for example, when there's existing buildings, we are helping mapping these existing buildings, making a resource catalog out of that, figuring out how to salvage materials, where to take them, who can remanufacture it, how to get it back into our project if we want to get it back in, or how to take it somewhere else. We do a lot of work around the sort of end users, thinking about the behavioral side of things. Who are we designing for in the building? How do we ensure that the building actually meet their requirements now? Any building, office building, shouldn't just be a holding pen for desks and people, right? It needs to be something that's experiential, interesting, that brings people back into the city. And so a lot of that stuff is going on. And then finally, I think we love to go back and see the buildings with people in them. I'm sure all architects do, but getting back in a systematic way and actually evaluating the building, really spending some time going through. We've developed our own methodology for doing post-occupancy evaluations and learning about the buildings and then feeding that back into the design process.
But do you think that every architectural practice should, what can I say, when the design is done and it's in use, then it doesn't stop? Because I would say that's the first phase. The second phase is how it is used. What can you learn from it?
I'm an anthropologist by training, and when I learned that architects don't get to see the buildings with people in them, that's not part of the standard services. I was absolutely flabbergasted. I mean, it's crazy, but it's tricky getting back into the buildings actually.
Why?
Maybe they've seen enough of the architect when I'm not sure.
I will not comment.
There could be different reasons, right? But I think we found certainly that actually getting back in and doing the evaluation. One thing is coming back and visiting and talking to people, but actually doing an evaluation can be a little bit invasive, right? You need somebody to hang around, talk to people, maybe for a week, maybe for 2 weeks if you're really serious about it. So it's a big decision. Sometimes the building owner is not the same as a tenant. There's a whole sort of landscape of conflicting interests that all got to be aligned for something like this to happen, and somebody's got to pay for it in the end, of course. So that challenges that side of it. And I think that's where some of the technologies that we're talking about here potentially can come in. So we've been looking at how to use computer vision to not count individuals or people, but rather count these quantifiable proxies for social interaction. So a camera can recognize 2-3 persons in 3 chairs around a table, or they could count us as 3 people, or they could count us as a situation talking, right? Which can be an indicator of what goes on in a certain type of space. So we've been looking at ways of scaling that information in ways that were less invasive and where we can tap into systems already there in the building, which hopefully can make this easier.
Sort of ramification. I mean, I think there is a traditional way of engaging with built architecture for architects. So we have defects ramification. So we do actually go in and sort of just adjust things and correct things. I think that's a process maybe that is less research driven, but there is closure.
Sure. I think there's something that happens in a building in the immediate weeks after, and then there's something that happens
several years in cases,
3 years down the line when the company is different, and definitely.
Yeah, and like you said, it's different if you ask the building owner or the tenant.
Sure.
You can have 2 very different opinions on that.
Sure. We saw a shift during and post-COVID, also different interests around indoor environments, and especially air quality, access to fresh air, access to outside areas, what we call green amenities, so parks, winter gardens, whatever it is, but stuff that can break down the office and give not just another programmatic experience, but also a different environment, and certainly drivers like air quality, daylight, these things are key, I think, for everything.
Does that also include biophilic design?
Exactly, yeah. Greenery, that's a key driver, definitely.
Any comments on that?
I agree.
That's easy, right?
I mean, especially in countries where AC is sort of almost overpowering, and you have audiences that suddenly start coughing and sneezing for no other reason, and it's just completely overpowered. But it is also very difficult in artificial environments to have good air quality.
But does that mean that for some designs you focus more on air quality or lighting or acoustic comfort, or?
I think you would try to optimize in every project.
Yes.
Right. You have obviously, I mean, I come from as a sort of private end user client residential environments where they have clear preferences and they state how many degrees they want at which given time of the day. So you obviously have to engineer a specific solution. I think what probably sort of sunk in a way that I think acoustic qualities of buildings are not necessarily the most striking kind of area where where we operate, but it's so important. I think the way we perceive sound and how buildings actually operate and talk to us. I mean, especially machine noise, plant noise that travels unhindered. I think this has been also really a challenge. But how sound operates with us in our kind of perception, I think is really tremendously important.
One of the interesting things, maybe if we were continuing this just a little bit, one of the things that we're quite keen on at the moment is thinking about how to design agency into the buildings. So the basic idea being that people are smart, buildings are still fairly dumb. So rather than have everything change and adapt to the individuals in the space, you can have people move around spaces. And so you can have people needing to go to a different climate zone, for example, we believe can be a positive thing. But at the same time, so one of the things you're thinking about, what differences do people then need? So they need programmatic differences. You need to be able to sit down and chat. You need to be able to focus and work. You need to be able to go somewhere social. But you also need atmospheric differences, right? Somewhere where there are different acoustics, where there are different views and experiences. And at the moment, we're thinking about how to efficiently program larger buildings so that we have all these aspects of the experience of space tied into the design, so that there is a proper diversity and opportunity for people to move around.
And I think also occupants enabled to actually interact with the building themselves, that you can actually open a window. In some of the early passive house studies, there were prisons, right? And minimal opening sizes just to save energy, but ultimately for the users, I think it was terrifying. And I think that's where probably good architecture should be, is that you enable the users to do a simple thing to change their condition and to have variation.
Certainly.
Many research shows that one of the most important things when you design a building is people want to be in control.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And they cannot always, but I can understand. Well, as an anthropologist, what has been most successful in truly understanding human needs?
What has been most successful? I mean, as an anthropologist, nothing beats going out and talking to people. It really is that simple sometimes. Doing it in the right way, doing it in a way where, let's say we wanted to know about the acoustics. The idea is not to go out and ask somebody about acoustics. I mean, if somebody came in to my office and asked me about acoustics, I, working adjacent to that, would have a challenge answering that, right? So from the anthropology side, figuring out how to ask people in a way where you can actually get a good response and what to do with that, I think is incredibly effective. We're seeing, I'm just looking at what you have up there. I mean, one of the interesting things that we're doing at the moment that we're seeing a lot of interest around is these sensorial mappings, which is less based around interviews and much more immersive. So we'll send people to a site and around a site to experience the site and record their experiences and start thinking about what's the identity of the site, what's adjacent to it, who's moving through it, and how do whatever we design start responding to that context in a meaningful way rather than come in as a sort of a UFO from the outside. And that's actually really getting a lot of interest at the moment from cities. So the whole planning process is showing that you understand the place you're designing for. So I think it's a toolbox with different tools. It's not one thing to rule them all. Having these different perspectives all really help. But baseline, if you're in doubt, go and talk to people.
And then when in your opinion, what is more important, what the client needs or what the client wants?
We try to make them want what they need, right? I mean, that's part of the discussion is having that conversation about, okay, you want to have high ambitions. Here's what high ambitions look like. Are you ready to go that way? What's most important? You know, that's I think that's part of the service is coming from an organization that has been primarily research-based, moving into being able to sell some of that knowledge as consultancy has been interesting. And reflecting on what we're selling, I think at the moment, there's a bit of a worry, I would say, from the people with the money and the power to make decisions that maybe business as usual is not the best business. Maybe having a building made where you focus too much on the budget and nothing else is not going to mean that building is going to be viable in 10 years or 20 years. So there's right now a genuine opening, at least from the people we're working with, to reconsidering some of these choices at the early stages. And that's where the research methodology starts to make sense. So we can figure out, well, let's have a look at this challenge. Let's figure out if we could actually transform this building rather than demolish it. Or let's figure out what it would require to create a building that is flexible so we can adapt to future, whatever it is the question is, right? And that openness, I think, is really what's changing things now. And that's where the research-based methodology really comes in and can do something.
I think it's definitely a bit too late to find out the value of your project when it's built. Right? I mean, that's a very expensive process. I think the understanding of what value means in architecture, I think, is also quite a bandwidth, and therefore I think the dialogue clearly is the way to do that. We have, of course, internal discourse, internal typologies and solutions we can bring to the table, but then ultimately the decision making, the dialogue is what matters, and also clearly information that can infuse and accelerate and also heighten the discourse. Otherwise, you will not end up with architecture. I think there is no out of the box process, I think.
Are there any possibilities in using VR environments to improve experience and comfort?
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned the acoustic oralization. So I don't know if I've talked about it, but we can simulate scientifically rendered acoustic solutions in spaces and make them transparent to the user to see what occupancy sounds like, what buildings actually sound like. We have thermodynamic simulations from the MEP guys, ventilation, how air flows move through spaces. All that can be experienced in VR and detail to a level that you wouldn't have in a two-dimensional diagram or in scenarios that are not in that level of resolution. I mean, for us, the definition of virtual is obviously a little bit wider, I think, from where we are with the commerce. So it's not all stereoscopic. It's also real-time, also two-dimensional projections. We can also work with caves and have multiple stakeholders in the same space. But ultimately, the goal is to communicate, but also to optimize the spaces and iterate faster and more precisely through our design development. And I think that's where we are, I think, seeing most of the benefit, is that we can end up cycling through different design options, different design solutions, sketches that can be experienced in full scale.
And how can that include the basic human needs? I mean, VR is very scientific. You can do a sensorial calculation or something for the acoustics,
Right.
And it complies to this standard with this reverberation time, but it doesn't mean that people having an acoustic comfort there.
Well, I mean, you can obviously see how a boardroom sounds with full occupancy or with just two people, what's coming out of the speakers. Materiality, I mean, clearly we don't have haptics unless we afford augmented reality, but there is a lot of information that we can convey. And I think that's clearly also then dictating better outcomes, right? I mean, if we have now a new sampler, a new technology where we can scan real-life physical materials and turn them into digital twin sort of copies, and we can apply that to our assets and have people seeing the texture of a carpet or a material. And I think that's clearly a level of insight that we can generate. No other technology allows us. We've been shipping physical materials, little samples across the world, but they never really capture the way how we can simulate light, how it bounces off surfaces. And again, I think it's really about the experience. How do you envisage yourself in your future space?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Kåre, do you see GXN introducing VR in practice?
But yeah, I mean, as I said, we already have. It's a bit of an interesting one. So we've used it on quite a few projects, and I think we've sort of followed the general hype cycle maybe that's been around this, in that there was a lot of attention and work around this a couple of years ago. It's sort of petered off a little bit. I know it's been helpful, and we have this set up in technology. I think from where I'm sitting, and this is maybe more on me than the rest of the company, I think I'm still seeing a little bit of a technology looking for a problem to solve. I'm not sure necessarily. I mean, I can see the use cases that Helmut are bringing forward. Whether that fits in with the way we're working, right? I mean, that's the other thing. Whatever you're doing has got to fit within the large organizational logic of the place you are to see something work.
And the economy.
And the economy, not least.
Sure, obviously.
We're curious. We keep experimenting, and we do that with a lot of things to stay in the loop. But right now, I don't see the use case for us from where we are.
And AI?
Yeah, we have. I mean, if you want to think about how AI is changing the way we visualize architecture. I mean, you should think about Enscape, which is built on these like crazy rendering engines that allow us to create images a lot faster. So that's already baked in. We do research, as I mentioned, with the industrial PSD we had with the cameras, with the machine vision.
Yeah.
A lot of the off-the-shelf tools that are out there at the moment we've tested, they don't fit particularly well into the workflow, or they don't produce particularly good results. But of course, it's changing what we're thinking about and how we're working on a number of levels. But if AI is an architect killer, I don't really trust that.
Maybe on that note, we obviously have hired dedicated research on AI and the application of it in the early ideation of the sketching form of formulation. But we're also convinced that it will not be the end of architects, human architects. I think AI...
Human architects. Do you see artificial architects coming up?
No, I think there's obviously at the moment there's such a strong kind of I think overrated kind of hype on what AI means and what it does, and I think it will not end us as a species. But there is clearly help in getting a very broad understanding of what has been done and what has been generated by us as a society, as a species, and LLMs are extremely helpful in the way we can access knowledge and also fuse knowledge into propositions, into new ideas is stunning, absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, what it doesn't deliver yet is three-dimensional space. I think LLMs cannot be trained the same way on three-dimensional assets as they can be trained on textual or image-based information. And that's widely available and has been made available by us in our slightly naive operations with the internet. But 3D assets are actually under lockdown. We have no access in the same way, in the same magnitude as the other sources. So I think there is going to be a much steeper learning curve to actually operate in three-dimensional space. What we're doing with AI is ultimately just image-based. Therefore, I think we will have a bit of time left. But AI will come in the way how we envisage virtual spaces. And we haven't talked about metaverses. We haven't talked about collective virtual spaces that are developing. Of course, we had a slump after Meta went in too fast. But there is a very steady development of non-physical reality, collective environments that are commercial, and they will ultimately extend our way we do business, our way we socialize. I mean, we have younger generations already in virtual space socializing via Minecraft and Roblox, and this will mature. And I think our expectations, we see already from clients the way how they consume our VR products at least at the moment, but ultimately when the Minecraft generation will come into client level, then they will expect a blended reality experience, a blended reality product. We call it cybernetic architecture, but it is ultimately an intermeshing of our information. Available
Cybernetic architecture.
Yeah. And it's both realities blended together in a sort of optimal way that we benefit from information overlays, from artificial constructs, language barriers, for example, right? I mean, if we did a competition for a boulevard in Paris for pavilions, and you have a multinational audience coming in over the seasons, and you could have overlays for those different types of people. So we're saying architecture will ultimately extend out into the virtual space, and they will be baked in very specific mixtures of virtual and physically real environments. And I think that's where we talk about comfort as well, right? What is it that we need as a species? How do we socialize? How do we set up in a global environment? And global issues like climate change, etc. How do we deal with it? I mean, how do we create policies? How do we exchange opinions? I think two-dimensional Facebook and Zoom is not sufficient to express and to really interact remotely. But we'll see.
Kåre's knocking, so you agree? Or?
I guess I wanted to ask if the hardware is, I mean, one thing is that idea about a seamless experience. Another thing is in putting on these glasses and having that part of the experience.
Yeah.
So that could be one way of taking the discussion. I think the other thing that's a little bit interesting that might be worth discussing is that One of the barriers I would see to introducing more automation into architecture, for example, is that there's a high degree, and I would want to ask about the VR side of this. There's a high degree of thinking and analysis that works through the sketching for the architects to understand a complex brief and solve that. You know, you're working through the whole thing, creating a volume studies, creating the plans, applying skills that are based in certain technologies, 2D, 3D in this case, to get an intuitive understanding of the project that allows you to become creative and create something beautiful, right? Automating part of that means that you might lose part of your handle on a project. Every technology comes in with a new set of skills, potentially taking out another set of skills. And we can see now with our presentations just in the last couple of years, especially driven by Enscape and the fact that these sort of images are becoming cheaper and easier to produce, that we are really ramping up in how we present our projects visually. And I'm wondering from where you're sitting also, I mean, you guys are obviously ramping up.
But I have not talked about automation, right? So, I mean, the design, the control.
But the image creation side is an add-on, of course, to the sort of classic like plan, all this other stuff. But I'm wondering how you're balancing this sort of stuff, that a lot of energy can go into producing beautiful images that might not actually work in plan, and how you balance these two things, for example. I can see there's a challenge there when the technology becomes the driver.
I mean, we would imagine when we started using offline high definition atmospheric photorealistic renders, I think we're pretty much sort of a precursor to VR and also AI generated images. And I think there is always going to be kind of a cultural response to that, and there's a hype, and then ultimately you will slowly come to a kind of a very pragmatic usability of this technology. I'm clearly seeing at the moment there is a hype in AI, and we're certainly seeing that all architecture will be generated by some LLMs for us. But a good functioning piece of architecture is a very difficult thing to do, and it has to do with a lot of compromises and a lot of decision making that you will have with your client in your conversations. AI does not have the existential drive and the need to make compromises. It will learn a lot, it will have a lot of oversight, and will be able to inject ideas or surprises, right? I mean, that we all need in order to be creative. But I think it's not going to be the decision maker, is not going to be the creator, and there's nothing automated about it, right? I mean, I have not experienced a single project that was identical to the other and the previous one, right? So we always have to make very unique decisions that have to come from us as humans, as users and creators.
How are you embedding the production team? I imagine there's a production team to create the VR experiences that you use to have these conversations with the clients. How are they? Are they sitting next to the design team? Are they embedded within the? Like, how does that link?
So I had my first encounter with AI as a commercial request, and it was the project director that we had extensive conversations about the program, about the design projects, and now she requested AI input. Right? So in a way, we're already talking about the secondary step. There's a brief, there's an understanding of the project, and then the content is going to be injected, and we have options. I mean, this is something we would have done by hand, or we were still doing by hand in most cases. So I don't think there is a big loss of control, right? It's really about, first of all, it is fed and trained on our work, and it knows what we want, and we have obviously the interaction with the software, but ultimately the decision has to be made by the humans, right? And also at the moment it's two-dimensional, so to actually extract it and turn it into a precise piece of space and architecture, you still have to flesh it out to it manually. To do this via LLMs, I think we're not quite there yet, right? We're dealing with height maps. I mean, we're trying to extract spatial information, but this is coming from two-dimensional kind of material.
I can see the role, and this is probably also more the approach that we're taking to this, that there are very specialist areas where these things can become helpful. Like a little bit like we're working with simulations, right? I mean, so we can find, it's about finding the right problem again for the technology to actually become meaningful in answering. And I think some of the key questions where you need a lot of variations around something, for example, where you have certain things that you can ask, we can see these things come in and we're experimenting with it, but it's about, again, at least again, from where we're sitting, working from inside the workflow, understanding that if you were to create a perfect workflow for technology, it would look very different than what we have, and it's going to be very hard to actually drive that through with the sort of cultural and organizational aspects of the studio as well, right?
Well, I don't necessarily see such an enormous shift. Right? I think the workflow, the actual process is not that much changed.
Right.
But there's hidden costs, obviously. There's also hidden sustainable aspects, right? Because big server farms waste a lot of energy. But we will see what the future holds. I mean, I'm agnostic. I think AI clearly helps mediate certain information, certain decisions, helps to support us in those decisions. And, I mean, we will see what we would do without it very soon, maybe.
Another question, what forms of industry collaborations would be useful in moving sustainable buildings forward? Who wants to start on that one?
I have a very simple, very complex solution. I mean, for me, it's
very simple, complex solution.
It is about the congregation of decision makers, of stakeholders, specialists, information, research, and for that, I think there is a platform needed in which we can communicate. We need to understand.
What kind of platform?
Well, I'm coming to this design platform that we were trying to develop. I think ultimately it is communication. That is the biggest bottleneck, and this is also the biggest risk in our industry, right? Where you have special forms of knowledge sitting in pockets that are not coming together, and translation issues, right? So if information is withheld or wrongly communicated, I think we did a lot of forensics on the overall architecture, let's say, of architectural design processes, the stakeholders involved, and you're dealing with multiple parties involved with various different degrees of expertise and language, nomenclature, and that's why I think we need to talk about the connectivity between those players. Everything else will be falling into a more streamlined and more sustainable solution. I think that's my main focus.
Hard to disagree. I mean, the build environment construction is incredibly siloed. At the same time, there's amazing collaboration happening on projects. Sure. But I think it stays within the project a lot of the time. It doesn't really scale. When we were starting out looking at the circular economy, pushing that forward, we sort of went around and talked to a lot of the different stakeholders, and everybody you ask is always pointing to the next person up and saying, it's this person. If they just ask for it, or if they just could deliver it. What we've tried to do is, on some projects, get everybody around the table from the earliest stages, and sharing a shared ambition. For example, we designed the Circle House, which is the idea that 60 housing units, social housing here in Denmark, fully circular, meaning that 90% of all the materials in the building can be reused without significant loss of value at the end of their life. 90. Yeah. So clearly, different way of thinking about how to put this stuff together was required. To solve that, we got all the different people together around the table. There's a communal design studio developing the ideas. There's a lot of producers coming in. The interesting thing is, rather than reinvent the wheel and come up with a perfect system for this one building that nobody would ever be able to build.
Is it possible to do?
We could actually work with a lot of existing systems and then start working together. So as an example, for example, Finnish manufacturer of concrete fittings, having these steel fittings allow you to put concrete together, and you can potentially take elements apart. That requires cement mortar to close out. We can find a chalk-based mortar from another producer that you could actually use to close this out. We could take out and we can have a circular system. That type of system solution can come if people are together more. So I think there's one level, and then I would agree with Helmut that knowledge sharing amongst the decision makers that can help also set a shared ambition.
But I did want to limit that to the project team itself. I think we need to talk about ecosystems and larger extents and users, future users, buy-ins, communities, and that's the extent I meant. I mean, not just a project team. Sure.
First of all, I want to have a big applause for Helmut and Kåre.
Thank you.
It was an honor to have a conversation, and also for you. Thank you for your time and effort coming here, and I hope you enjoy 3 days of design. Thank you.
Super.